Hi, I'm Firewalker. I was a Christian for most of my life. I grew up in a Christian household, went to church, grew up in Christian schools from preschool all the way through college, and recently I decided that I'm officially no longer a Christian. And that's a decision that has led to a lot of unrest in my family. It's been almost 3 months now in August that my parents and I haven't spoken, and that's due mostly to this decision that I made. So I wanted to share some of the things that led me to say that I'm no longer a Christian, that led me to abandon my faith in the hopes that maybe it'll help someone else who's struggling similarly, or at the very least it'll help me just to get it out there. The first domino really that just set the whole thing going was when I rejected the doctrine of human responsibility. And this was a result of a social psychology class I was taking actually at a Christian university, and came to the conclusion that there's so much that influences who we are and our personality, from brain development to hormones to medications, electricity, electrodes, etc., that basically we can't be anything other than what we are. And that really eliminates the element of sin, and without that, everything else just started to unravel. One thing that I found interesting in my search, I actually came across on Essence of Thought's channel, and it's the idea of Christianity as an abusive relationship. I've linked his video down below, but I wanted to share with you a couple of the checklist items that I found from his video and some of my own research. So, do you avoid certain topics out of fear of angering your God, like your doubts or your questions? Do you feel you can't do anything right, or believe you deserve to be hurt or mistreated or damned to hell? Are you afraid of your God most of the time? Does your God criticize or put you down, ignore you, or put down your opinions and accomplishments? Does he blame you for his abusive behavior, act excessively jealous and possessive, control where you go or what you do? Or maybe he hurts you, or threatens to kill you, or threatens eternal damnation. If so, you might be a Christian. Gender inequality is something that's bothered me for a long time, even as a little girl, because I've always had a heart for justice. It's always been something that I've been very passionate about, and the gender inequality in the Old Testament has been something that has always gotten to me. And what my professors and teachers have told me was that the law was progressive for its time. But once I found out that wasn't true, I was actually relieved I no longer believed in Christianity, because I didn't have to worry about reconciling this so much. The polygamy in the Old Testament, the fact that women have to marry their rapists, in some stories, slaves and daughters were actually offered to a mob of men for the purpose of rape. Under the law of Moses, if a man committed a sin worthy of death, then the Israelites not only killed him, but also his wife and his children, who honestly didn't have any say in the matter. It's not like the women really had any say in who they married, and the kids didn't ask for him to be their father. Even if they didn't have anything to do with the sin, they were still killed, and that has never struck me as just. The blind support of Israel is something that hasn't really bothered me until more recently. Back in about 2008, I went to a student leadership conference, and there were some students from Jordan and the Israel area that came to it as well, and we were able to sit down and talk to them, just our group, their group, and they shared with us how what we hate for security in the airlines, they have to go through every single day just to get to school. They talked about how families lost the homes, and how they've also seen officers dump the contents of kids' backpacks out onto the street in the puddles and just left it there and laughed. Because where there is power, there's also corruption. And with all the things in the news lately, with the bombings in Gaza, I don't know how you can play the victim and then bomb schools and kill innocent children. I don't understand how that could ever be okay. And honestly, for a while, I was terrified to withdraw support from Israel, to say that, hey, this is wrong, I don't support this, because I was afraid God would smite our nation or something if I didn't. And that's just another example of how God can rule through fear. The sanctity of marriage came into play, of course, when I had my first serious relationship. My now fiance actually refused to discuss this topic with me because he wanted me to come to my own conclusion, completely separate from him, without his influence or pressure or anything, so I could come to a decision for myself. And as I began to think about this and search for answers about this, I actually did a search of an online Bible for the phrase sacredness of marriage or sanctity of marriage and couldn't find it anywhere. I don't know where this terminology actually came from or how it became such a big deal in the Christian community as it is today. But in the Old Testament, we see that women have to marry their rapists, which hardly sounds sacred to me, and if it is, I don't want any part of it. We see polygamy, concubines, and one of the other things that occurred to me is that people married so young back then, right when they hit puberty, right when they started being interested in sex, because their lifespans were so short. It made sense then. But now that our lifespans are longer and we're marrying so much later in life, I'm not sure it's something that makes sense for us now. Growing up and always attending Christian schools, I was always taught about the infallibility of the canon, that basically everything is backed up by archaeology and historical facts that have been confirmed, etc. And so it never really made sense to me to question the canon and whether or not it was infallible. And it didn't really occur to me that it wasn't just written down as a book like we see today. It was actually a bunch of separate documents that were then chosen to be put into the book, that were then chosen to become the Bible. And humans were the ones who chose which documents to put in. And in my experience, whenever humans are involved, someone somewhere is going to get an ulterior motive. And I don't know how we can trust humans to put together an infallible book. And many of the documents that were rejected from the canon are really never discussed in Christian communities today, which bothers me. Because actually many of those accounts do not agree with what's in the canon. For instance, the virgin birth. Some of these documents, and I've been reading in the book, The Lost Scriptures, which is an excellent book that I will link down below. I read a couple of accounts where Mary was not a virgin, that Jesus is actually full-blooded human who came to be through human sexual intercourse. He is fully man, and that God chose him to be his son because he was the most righteous, which is an idea you also see in the story of Noah. Another account actually says he's an archangel, and that's one that was a little bit new to me. The resurrection stories in some of these other documents do not line up with either with each other or the canon, it seems. Every story has a different idea of who saw Jesus first after he rose, of how he was buried, of what they did with the to tie up loose ends, and it's become such a centerpiece of the Christian faith, and yet most people don't really know where it came from or why, or even realize that it's not something that is native to the Bible or Christ, really. And with so many of these accounts, so many of these documents, many of which we still haven't found, there could be so many more out there. And the ones we do have, most of them are partial. There are pages missing or parts of a page missing that we'll never find. We'll never know the rest of these stories. And knowing that, How can we pick out a few documents and make an entire religion out of it and say it's infallible, this is absolutely 100% the truth, and not think that maybe we could have missed something? That's an idea I can't get past. Long before I decided that I was no longer a Christian, it bothered me to identify myself as Christian. Whenever that came up, I would kind of cringe inside, like, oh my god, I have to tell them I'm a Christian. Oh, I feel so bad. Because the word Christian is meaningless in modern American society. It doesn't really mean anything about how you live your life or what you believe. And if anything, it's kind of taken over a negative connotation. And I live in the South, in the Bible Belt, where basically everybody is Christian. That is a normal thing. There are churches on nearly every single street corner. Some churches are just right next door to each other, and I don't know how that works out. With it being such a normal thing, it's just meaningless. I'm not really sure why anyone would want to identify themselves as Christian these days. Another thing that I think Christians and that I had a lot of trouble with was the no true Scotsman fallacy, where there's so many different people where being a Christian means something completely different to them than it might mean to somebody else. And so whenever you look at something that somebody who does something you disagree with, for me it might be the Westboro Baptist Church, I said, well, they're not real Christians. Real Christians wouldn't do that. But on the other hand, I'm sure the Westboro Baptist Church would look at me and say, she wasn't a real Christian. Real Christians wouldn't support same-sex marriage. She would support the Bible. And how can a religion that's supposed to be the one true religion, how can a God who's supposed to be the one true God make a religion that is so easy to interpret so many different ways, many of which actually hurt people and turn people away from wanting to be Christian or identify as Christian? Not that the book of Revelations being a vague prophecy is something that would cause me to turn away from my faith in and of itself, but it does continue to add on to my puzzlement on the whole idea of the infallibility of the canon. And there's an obsession, it seems, but especially nowadays, with the end of the world, the end times. And Revelations is the book that Christians will turn to about that. But the thing is, if you make enough prophecies, you're bound to get something right. And the more vague you make them, the easier it is to make it look like you got something right. In fact, there's a group who took the Revelations prophecies and applied it to Jesus, and actually think that Jesus is the Antichrist. So about the time that your prophecy can then be applied to your own Savior and make him the bad guy in all of this, it's not really as specific as you think, and I think that causes a lot of problems. But on the other hand, it is absolutely hilarious that you can do that. Pascal's wager kept me going, especially when I was younger, and I had doubts that I couldn't reconcile and kept bugging me, and I couldn't come to any conclusion about, couldn't come to any resolution. So I just thought, well, hey, maybe I should be a Christian just in case, because I don't want to go to hell, which is yet another example of being ruled by fear of an unhealthy relationship, an abusive relationship. But the thing is that Pascal's wager works only if you have two options. And as long as you have two options and no more, it actually works quite well, with the options being Christianity or atheism, heaven and hell or void. But once you factor in all of the world's religions, it just falls apart, because even if I believe in the Judeo-Christian God, if it doesn't exist and another God does, I might piss him off. That might not make my situation any better than not believing in any God at all. The story of Abraham, I'm definitely going to have an entire video on this, because there's so much in this story that bothers me. The only way the story of Abraham especially when it involves Isaac, doesn't sound crazy as if you've been brought up in the church and heard it so much so you've kind of become desensitized to it. Because nowadays, when you hear on the news that somebody drowned their kids or threw them off a balcony because the voice of God told them to, we think they're crazy. Because why would God tell them to do that? God would not tell somebody to kill their child. And yet we have this story of Abraham where he does exactly that. And I don't know what people are supposed to take from this. It's played up as a huge act of faith, something to kind of aspire to, but I don't want to aspire to not asking questions if somebody tells me to kill my child. I have serious issues with that. Which leads us as well to the topic of Sunday school. Growing up in a Christian environment, Christian schools, Christian churches, Sunday school and chapel was a big part of my life, and I absolutely hated it, especially chapel, because I'd heard the same stories so many different times that there was really nothing else for me to take from them, and they just became useless, almost cliches. We have the story of David, where David and Goliath specifically, and the story of Solomon, and how his wisdom was legendary. And these stories and stories like these are told to children and makes these characters role models to them, something to aspire to. But I don't think that's really setting them up with a good idea of a role model and what a role model should be to them, because David was also an adulterer and a murderer, and God told him, because of you, Israel is going to be in war for the rest of your lifetime. And then you have Solomon with his many wives and many concubines. And I really think that's setting kids up for disappointment in their heroes, and it's not telling them the whole truth. And those are just the reasons that I came up with off the top of my head of why I made the decision that I did. Again, I'm Firewalker. Please like, comment, subscribe, rate down below. I'd love to hear what you have to say, your thoughts on the topic. Thanks.